Yeah, good morning. I was checking out the news and the weather, as I usually do before coming in. I saw the Grand Prix car race in St. Pete today. And of course, they use Indianapolis 500 style cars. And it reminded me of Al Unser. I'm going to put up his picture in the Indianapolis 500 race. Al Unser came from a racing family. His dad was a car racer, and he had two older brothers who were car racers as well. One of them, Jerry, actually died in a car crash in Indianapolis, at the Indianapolis 500 race in 1959. You know, the race is over 100 years old now. But Bobby Unser, his older brother by about 5 years, had had some success there. And then Al started having a lot of success, and he won the race in 1970 and then again in 71. And then a few years later, in 1978, he won it. But, he'd be there every year, usually sponsored by one of the big race teams. But as time went by and Al got older, quote unquote, in 1987, the Penske race team who he was driving for decided to let him go. And Al had this goal, and that was that he wanted to win the Indianapolis 500 4 times, because the record of 4 times was held by A.J. Foyt. And he just knew that he was going to win the race in 1987, and then suddenly the Penske race team cuts him loose. Now, in Indianapolis, for about 3 weeks before the race, which is around Memorial Day every year, the teams head to Indianapolis to start tuning their cars and making sure that everything's running okay before the big race. So Al Unser went there to just kind of hang around, just see and know that somehow he was going to have a car to drive. And so he started getting a little bit discouraged. 1 week went by, and then the second week went by. So about a week out from the thing, he's thinking to himself, oh, maybe I should head home. And then it turns out a friend of his, they were having some trouble with his car, and they asked Al to come take a look at it, see if everything was up to snuff. They make all these adjustments to the chassis. And so Al decided to hang around an extra day. Well, on that day during the practice, one of the 3 drivers for the Penske race team that he had been fired from, essentially, got into a crash. And he got a concussion, so he wasn't allowed to drive. Also, the Penske race team was real excited about this new chassis they had developed, and they discovered that it wasn't working out very well. So they decided that they were going to scrap the idea of using the new chassis and just use their old cars. They had 2 of their old cars there as backups, but now they needed 3 drivers. So they called Al and said, would you be willing to drive for us? And the 3rd car was actually sitting in the lobby of the Sheraton Hotel in Reading, Pennsylvania, which is where the Unser racing team was, or not the Unser, the Penske racing team was based in Reading, Pennsylvania. So they had to go to the Sheraton Hotel, get the car, put it on a truck, and take it to Indianapolis. And because of the qualifying and all of that, and the car getting there late, Al Unser started out in 20th place. They've got this big, oval track, and so you start out with 3 in the front row, and then you work your way back, three rows, 3 at each row. So Al's in the 20th spot, and the race gets started. This is in 1987. And as the race is going, there are a number of cars that are just, conking out, a couple of minor crashes, everything's okay, but Al's just keeping with it and using all of his wisdom at age 48 to figure out, how to work his way to the front of the group. So a couple hours go by, and then at the 458th mile of the trip, this one driver who's in the lead pulls into the pit stop, where they change the tires, gas up the car, and all of that. And so he pulls in there, and his car stalls out. And they finally get it running about 10 or 12 seconds later, and he gets out there, but who is he behind but Al Unser? Al's in front place, and because he was one of the lower-tier drivers, he had already fueled up. So Al Unser kept going, and sure enough, he won the race. 4th time. Set the record. It was actually 5 days before his 48th birthday. But he's just saying, I just knew that I was going to win the race. So every time something happened, that seemed to discourage me, I just had to remind myself, no, I know I'm going to win the race. And he did. It's interesting that a lot of times when we get this feeling or this intuitive notion that there's something we need to do, and it just sticks with us, it's not a whim, that there are all of these discouraging things that happen. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more today. We're going through the book E Squared by Pam Grout. If you don't have the book and you've missed the last 2 weeks, no problem. Each one of the Sunday lessons stands on its own, but if you do want to see the previous lessons, they're at the bottom of our website, unitytampa.org, and we've also got them on the Facebook page. Since we're live stream, we also recorded there. And I guess I've already said that, never mind. We've got, of course, we record the services on CD is what I was thinking, and so you can always request one of those in the bookstore. So this week, we're going to be working on experiment number 4, the Abracadabra principle. The Abracadabra principle. And whatever you focus on expands. Whatever you're going to focus your energy on will grow in this physical world. Now, the word abracadabra is interesting because it's actually an Aramaic word. And for those of you in the know, the spoken words that Jesus spoke was Aramaic, which was very closely related to Hebrew, what the Old Testament was written in. But in the days of Jesus, they spoke generally Aramaic or Greek because they'd been conquered by the Romans and their language was Greek. And so Abracadabra, as we know, was a fine song by the Steve Miller Band in 1982. But it also is that, that sense of magic, casting magic. So what's all of this about? It's actually, the word abracadabra means to create as I'm speaking. To create as I'm speaking. And of course, in Unity, our Unity principles, we recognize that the spoken word does change the energy field around us. And we can indeed create the things that we pour our thoughts and our minds and our hearts and our passions into. In the Gospel of Mark, 11th chapter, Jesus says this, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." Now, this is another one of those Bible passages where you have to kind of ask, do you really believe that? Wow, picking up a mountain and casting it into the sea? Of course, there is the Jewish tradition of exaggeration. But he's trying to make a point here. Can you believe something and let go of the doubts that come up? So things do materialize out of what usually seems to be thin air, but most of the time you'll have a coincidence in your life. Something will just happen to surface, or you'll run into someone, or you'll hear something, and you recognize, wow, this is the answer to the question that I had in my mind, or this is the answer to the desire I have in my heart. So building on the previous chapters in this book, E Squared, and building on what we've learned from quantum physics in recent decades, we know about this field of possibilities, this field of potentiality that Pam Grout mentions. And now Pam does go to a Unity church in Lawrence, Kansas, and that's why she came up with this concept of how do we take these principles out to a wider audience? And how do we use scientific methods to prove that this stuff works? And in Unity, we call it spiritual substance, recognizing that there is this energy field that we can create, we can form things out of, molecules, atoms. If we are spiritual beings having a human experience, we have to recognize that in this human experience, we need money. we need things in this life to get us through. Jim Rosemergy, the Unity minister who recently retired down in Fort Myers, one of his books was Even Mystics Have Bills to Pay. And I'll bet at one time or another you may have come across some of the various books that have taught these lessons over the last 100 years. Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. Wallace Waddell wrote The Science of Getting Rich. Norman Vincent Peale was The Power of Positive Thinking. And then, of course, Claude Bristol, The Magic of Believing, and he goes on and on and on. These are old books that have been around, some for 50, 60 years, but they're still in print because they're telling you the truth, the spiritual truth about how this world works. Now, the word desire means of the Father. And I know, especially for me, coming out of a Roman Catholic background, there was that sense of we only pray to God about the important stuff. That some of this other stuff is just too frivolous. But Carla and I, lived in Chicago up until when we went off to Unity Seminary in the year 2000. And in a lot of the older neighborhoods of Chicago, buildings were built without any thought about parking, because virtually everybody would take buses or the electric trains, to go downtown or wherever they were to work. So parking was really at a premium, especially on the streets. So we would tease at Unity in Chicago that we would pray for a parking space. That just, what a coincidence, a car happens to be pulling out along the curb there on that street as I'm driving down that street so I can find a place to park, and it would work. But some people would feel kind of guilty about that. Now, speaking of cars, Carla and I, we met in 1987. We discovered Unity. Actually, we met in 86. We discovered Unity in 1987. And so we really got to learn the Unity principles and about, creating through our thoughts and our feelings. And we started actually teaching the prosperity seminars around the Unity churches in the Chicago area. And then we expanded to some of the other New Thought churches. But then suddenly we started teaching them all over the place. And we started doing it full time, and we needed a larger car than the dinky little car that we were driving at the time. So I was thinking around 1991 was when we really got rolling, and it was we need a car with more, a larger trunk. And SUVs weren't that popular back then as they are now. And I thought, well, we need to also have a car that's befitting of people who teach the prosperity principles. So I decided, okay, we're gonna get a Lexus LS400. They just come out 2 years before, and just a wonderful, dependable car. Lexus is Toyota's luxury division, and so it's got a nice big trunk. So I kind of put it out there. Okay, LS400, we're going to have it by Labor Day. And this was early in the year, and so I would put it out there. I'd visualize, Carla and I, Lexus LS400. And then I started seeing ads in the paper, because I'd read the paper every day. Are you considering an LS400? Why don't you also consider the Buick Park Avenue Ultra? And then it would have a comparison list of what these were like. And I thought, And I started realizing maybe I'm getting a message from beyond, because when you do set a goal, if there's something better for you, the universe lets you know. You are prevented from making any major mistakes in your life, or any major mistakes that you don't need to make, I guess is a good way of putting it. So I discovered in one of Chicago's suburbs there was a Lexus dealer and a Buick dealer right near each other, about a block away. So I went up and drove both of them. And I was like, wow, yeah, I am really seeing that they're very comparable. Hardly a difference in the way they ride, and the Buick's trunk is even a little bit bigger. And then I started thinking, yeah, but in dependability, you can't beat Japanese dependability. Well, it turns out the engine in the Buick was the most dependable engine that General Motors made, and had very good ratings in Consumer Reports, et cetera, et cetera. So Carla and I would start to go out there to the Buick dealer on Sundays. The dealers were closed on Sundays, to just look and visualize the car. And one day, we were out there, and we're checking door handles, especially on the one that we really liked, and it was open, so we got to sit in there, smell that leather, that new car smell, and picturing this car. And I found a video that that was like a review of by Car and Driver magazine on the Buick. So we just would visualize, and we had this goal that was going to happen by Labor Day. And we're getting close to Labor Day at the end of August, and it's kind of like I'm not seeing the financial substance materialize for us to buy this car. We hit the Labor Day weekend, and then there's an ad in the paper, because it's the end of the car year, when you hit Labor Day. you can now get a Buick Park Avenue Ultra for zero money down and $500 per month for 36 months. And that fit into Carlos and my budget. And so we signed the papers and we drove that car for 3 years. It's still one of my favorite cars. But recognize some of the things that I learned in that process. There was that sense of like, okay, I set a goal, a specific date. I set a goal for one thing, but then was guided that maybe there's something even better. And when it got to the time, I wasn't set on it happening in a particular way. Here I was thinking I had to buy the car, but instead I had the opportunity to lease it for 3 years. So what is it that you want in your life? What is it you'd like to see materialize? What sort of coincidence would you like to have happen in your life? One of the challenges is that many of us have been raised and had our experiences, pleasant and unpleasant, and so we find ourselves saying things, well, I need to be realistic. And as Eric Butterworth, the former Unity minister, passed away a few years ago, he used to say, when someone says to me, I need to be realistic, I recognize what they're saying is, I don't really believe these spiritual principles work. Now, outer appearances come up. But we need to kind of test the outer appearances. Trying to remember his name, the head of Swiss Air, talked about running through walls. You know, that sometimes there seems to be an obstacle there that you can't make your way through. He says, but I would encourage my people to go ahead and run through that wall. Test it. See if it's just an illusion or if it is indeed an obstacle that you can't go through. And he says, 9 times out of 10, I find it's an illusion. But when we do set a goal, we hit what's called first force. Second force is anything within our experience and our belief systems that's opposed to that suddenly materializes in the world for us. And so we have an opportunity to look at these things and say, well, is this true? Is this really what is true about the world and the spiritual principle? And so by testing it, pushing against it, you begin to see whether it will fall or not. If it doesn't fall, you may be getting guided that, yeah, maybe you need to try a different route. But like I say, most of the time you find that, oh, yeah, that experience taught me that it can't work because it didn't work back then. Well, perhaps it'll work now. It's a different time. You're a different person. You have different consciousness. In the book, E Squared, Pam talks about this field of potentiality, like the Holy Spirit, spiritual substance. And she says, let's imagine that you're in one place and you want to be in another place. You recognize you don't like it in this place. And so she uses the example of Biloxi, Mississippi, and New Orleans. She says they're about 92 miles apart, and you need to travel from Biloxi to New Orleans. Now, of course, you can take a car, you can walk, whatever, but you go, you leave. But then what happens along the way? Suddenly you start, oh, boy, it sure is ugly out here. Doesn't look anything about like New Orleans, so maybe I should go back to Biloxi. Or the weather will be bad, and you start to think, well, maybe I made a mistake by taking off on this trip. Maybe I need to go back to Biloxi. What's happening here? Well, I mentioned all of these old experiences come up, and as I've mentioned before in this series, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. So we create this ego, which takes the ball and runs with it. It's like, here's my vision for what I want in the world. Take the ball and run with it, Mr. Ego, and my ego runs with it. But then suddenly I have realized, oh, wait a minute, no, I don't want to be in Biloxi, I want to be in New Orleans. Suddenly that ego, this entity that you've created for yourself to have a human experience says, what? No, wait a minute, we've been working on Biloxi now for 10 years. We can't just throw that away. So rather than see it as a resistance, see it as something you can coach. It's like, yeah, I understand. And Biloxi's been good for us in these last 10 years, but let me show you what it can be like in New Orleans. And so when panic comes up, we just keep walking. We think about the trip that we're taking, not trips that we've taken in the past. If we're feeling bored, think about the future rather than the past. Remember in the second Star Wars movie, Episode 5, Luke Skywalker meets Yoda, and he says, Yoda, well, I'll try. And Yoda says, no try. You either do or you do not do. There is no try. So, there's no need to feel guilty. An important element of this, though, is to be able to put your passion into it. Like Carla and I, it's like we could, test drive that car. We could feel that car. We could put yourself into the picture. Just visualize it as happening. Visualize, in fact, whenever you have a problem in your life, if you just pause for like 3 minutes, take a nice deep breath, center yourself, and then picture yourself with that problem solved. You don't have to have the solution to the problem. Just picture who you would be if that problem was solved. Just take about 2 or 3 minutes. Just see how that would feel. Who would I be being if this problem were solved? And then just open your heart in gratitude at the end of those few minutes and let it go. Let that prayer go off into the ethers. So, Pam Grout writes on page 72, well, the only reason we don't change water into wine or heal cancer with one touch is because our thoughts are scattered. Instead of being one constant, well-aimed laser, our thoughts are more like a middle high school band of beginning trumpet players. So, on page 75, she talks about 4 ways that she's noticed the mind works in opposition to our goals. Number 1, I'm going to have Duncan jump forward 2 slides there, is ruts. 60,000 thoughts a day is what psychologists and psychiatrists say. We have 60,000 thoughts a day, and yet it's amazing how she says 98% of them are repeats of something we thought about yesterday or wishing away the way things had been. So we get into this rut, and she mentions, a dog with an invisible fence. They put the shock collar on the dog, and they put this wire in there, and the dog tests the boundaries until it realizes, okay, I need to stay within this space, because if I go beyond that space, I'll get a shock. So what's your invisible fence? What have you set up from your previous experiences that's holds you back? Number 2 is advertising. Yes. They say that we see up to 3,000 ads a day. They can be ads, they can be logos, whatever. I know I enjoy watching the evening news, being a former radio TV guy, and it's amazing, like I teased with Carla, I said, look at who's advertising on the evening news. Pharmaceuticals on parade. And each one of them tell you about some malady that you have. Does your mouth feel a little bit dry right now? Do you feel some sniffles? And then they pitch to you what it is that you need to have to solve that problem. Number 3 is other thoughts of the human race consciousness. We create, a human race consciousness of all of our experiences. And it does touch, the spiritual realm, but a lot of times we pick up on other people's thoughts or feelings in the room, especially in unity, because most of us who come to unity are very intuitive people. And so we can pick up on what's going on, or other people's thoughts. And that's one reason meditation is so important, because in those meditations we begin to see how our mind works and latch on to thoughts that should just be floating by, but we start to think that we need to play with them. It's like, no, just let them go by. And then number 4 is our own thoughts, taking ourselves out of the equation, giving in to our feelings of unworthiness or our past experiences. The other thing that Pam mentions, which I'm glad she did, is acting out of a sense of desperation. Because that also is a way of letting go of spiritual principle. Many of you are familiar with Lourdes, France. Back in 1858, there was a young woman named Bernadette who was being teased because she wasn't doing very well in her catechism at her Catholic grammar school in this little town in France. And yet, one day she sees this apparition of the Virgin Mary and talks with the Virgin Mary. And she has 18 of these incidents over like about a 4-month period. And as she as she shared it with other people, they would really give her a hard time. And of course, the nuns and the priests, would ask her, or would tell her questions to ask the Virgin Mary to kind of test out whether or not, she was just faking it. And what they found was like, no. I mean, this woman is telling us stuff that this little 14-year-old girl is telling us stuff there's no way she could have known from school. And then one day she's guided by Mary to dig a hole and to eat of the vegetation that's there. And out of that hole bubbles this spring. And within a few days, a blind man who has healed himself of his blindness by rubbing the water on his eyes. And now Lourdes, France, here, 1858, can't do math in my head that quick, but it's like 16,000 people a day visit this place to see if they can be healed. And one of the chaplains at Lourdes says something interesting. He says, I notice that the people who are desperate are not healed. He says the people who have healing all have one thing in common, and that is they have recognized that whatever illness that they have has been a blessing to them. They've learned from it, but they're ready to let go of it. He says those are the ones that are healed. So, when we do have a challenge come into our lives, yeah, it's good for us to recognize the lessons we've learned from it. Now, after these first 3 experiments, we're on experience number 4, the Abracadabra principle. So what she says is, okay, we've talked about just generalities, putting out the first experiment was, God, give me a sign that you exist. This one is now finally, okay, God, here is what I want to manifest. Here's what I want to demonstrate in 48 hours. So choose something. What do you want to manifest? And as Pam Grob points out, you might not want to start with moving a mountain into the sea. But what do you think is possible that you can manifest through coincidence or seemingly out of thin air? Go ahead and choose it and set yourself up for a win, like I say, by choosing something you believe is possible. Choose to have it happen in the next 48 hours. That's the experiment for this week, the Abracadabra experiment. Now, in a few minutes, we'll be doing our meditation. And what I want you to do is, during those 10 minutes of silence, picture what it is you'd like to see create in your life. But also, I'd like to ask you, start out by just picturing Unity of Tampa, as thriving in consciousness, people, and revenues as we are going through this transition of finding a new location. Our closing video is a video from Steve Hartman of the CBS Evening News.
Wow. Here's what
For as long as her parents can remember, 11-year-old Brianna Carsey has had this crazy dream. She has always wanted a broodmare, a mommy horse, that would give birth to a baby horse that would grow up to become a racing champion.
Absolutely. This was a fairy tale for her from day one. We put it off for 5 years almost because we don't have a farm. So we got to go rent stalls somewhere.
This sounds expensive.
Yeah.
Why don't you say no?
Well, as she'll tell you, she has me wrapped around her finger.
Okay.
Her foal, an Ohio Standard bred, was born in the spring of 2013. She named it MJB Got Faith. MJB for the initials of the kids in her family, and Got Faith for the faith she instantly had in him.
I really loved him.
From the beginning.
He's super soft too.
Sweet. But that quick bond posed a real problem for this pushover dad.
Come here, bud.
See, for whatever reason, Brian thought once he explained to his daughter that her horse could never race, that it was a runt from poor breeding stock, she would just agree to sell it. But obviously not.
She's like, there's no price, Daddy. So I'm talking to my wife. It's like, we really got ourselves in a mess here.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we're going to get out of this. So we stake him to the races.
This horse that doesn't belong in the races.
The horse that I thought we should have gotten rid of already.
He was more about the money.
What were you seeing that your dad wasn't seeing?
He didn't believe in him.
Brian was stuck, committed to boarding and training this long shot to end all long shots.
Yep.
And this is not a wealthy family. Brian runs a small logistics company, and Ohio Racing, which is harness-style racing, is a $900 million a year industry.
I want to see him go fast.
MJB Got Faith was so slow he barely even qualified to compete. But then somehow, someway, won his first race. Won his second race, his third, and his fourth, qualifying him for the state championship held recently in Columbus, Ohio.
And I said, baby, if you finish third, you should be so thankful. She goes, Daddy, if he finishes last, I'm going to be thankful. But he's going to win.
JB got faith in the inside.
And so it was that this little horse with no pedigree, this pet with no reason for being here beyond the blind faith of a little girl, won an Ohio Sire Stakes championship.
She said, Dad, I told you got to have faith.
Brianna took home $100,000 that day. She has already given away half of it to charity. And as for the other half, she plans to use that money as a down payment on a farm.
I just want to have a farm and be able to go walk out my back door and see him.
And that's her plan for happily ever after. Just a girl, her horse, and knowing her father,
Dad, can we please get a cat?
No.
probably a cat, too. Steve Hartman, on the road in Connorsville, Indiana.
Good thing that girl didn't have that faith trained out of her yet. Closing Bible verse, Gospel of Mark, 11th chapter, 22nd verse. And Jesus said to them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And may you always be open to God's guidance and grace." Let's prepare for meditation.
Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, with thanksgiving. I'll be a living sanctuary for you. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, with thanksgiving. I'll be a living sanctuary for you. Sanctuary for you.
If you haven't already, close your eyes. Take a nice deep breath. Feel all tension just drain out of your body.